I hope I
And it
do
still wasn't
fairly well.
enough.
No,
Still just
okay.
wasn't enough.
Well, I want to thank you, Ben, and I want to thank Looking Glass for hosting this event. They're a great dealer. I really, really look forward to getting out to the Berkeley area sometime soon when all this kind of fades into our distant memories. With that being said, I hope everybody is doing well and staying safe and continue to stay safe and well. And I want to thank you for coming. Today's presentation is on the mysteries of night photography. I know for me, the first time I went to go out shoot at night to get the stars and do night photography in general, I was kind of taken aback thinking, oh my goodness, there's got to be so much more to it than just regular photography. And then you start capturing images at night and you realize it's just a matter of taking control of your camera and doing the right exposures, because everything's the same: composition, the exposure, setting things up. It's just with less light. So hopefully with this presentation I take away some of that mystery and you go out there and capture some night images as well. My name is Ken Hubbard. I am the field service manager of Tamron. I have 7 technical representatives that work with me. And under normal conditions, we're traveling around the US, giving seminars, workshops, working trade shows, and taking tons of pictures. I'll give you locations and stuff like that of the pictures, extra information, just so you know, and hopefully inspires you to go there. This is Guanacaste, Mexico, and it was a beautiful location as well that I went to a couple of years ago. So getting into the presentation now, let me just move a couple of things on my screen so I see everything and do anything bad here. Okay. Some of the topics I'm going to talk about today are understanding the controls of your camera, aperture, shutter, and ISO. Going back to the basics and taking control, because in night photography, that's what you're going to need to do. You're going to have to take a little bit more control of your camera, not so much work in shutter priority or aperture priority or auto. You're going to have to go into manual and start using those controls to create the images that you're looking for. Knowing your lenses and what to use and when. It may seem simple, oh, I'll just take this lens out tonight and shoot with it. But what does that lens do? Wide angle, telephoto, normal lenses all have a different look to it. So choosing the right one for the images you're trying to create is extremely important. What's in my bag and what do I take around? What do you need to create these images? There are some specific things that you'll need to really help you create the images. What's the difference between sunset, blue sky, and black sky? Understanding what happens at night with the sky and how dark it does actually get. Composition, focal points, leading lines, scale, all those elements to create a good composition in your image. As well as, of course, we're going to talk about stars and how to capture the Milky Way and all that fun stuff. So understanding your camera's controls, taking control of your camera, like I said, going into manual and going back to the basics of understanding aperture, shutter, and priority to create the proper exposure. You're also going to be having to do a little bit more with manual focus as well. I know as time goes on and I get older, my eyes are bad to begin with, that I've become very reliant on autofocus. But more often than not, you definitely have to use manual focus as well. But I'll teach you some techniques on that as well. So taking over your camera and understanding, using this exposure triangle to capture the images correctly. And it's not so much just, okay, apertures in your lens, shutters in the camera, ISO is the sensitivity of your sensor. It goes into actually what you want to do with all of these subjects. More often than not, for night photography, there's 2 things I'm thinking about first. It's either aperture or shutter, one of those 2 things. Do I need depth of field when it comes to aperture, or can I get away with shallow depth of field? Of course, with Aperture, when you're wide open, the number's smaller. The f-stop is 1.4, 2.8, f4. That means it's wide open, letting in a lot of light, but your depth of field is shallower. As you stop down, the opening gets smaller, larger depth of field, but realize that's letting in less light because the opening is smaller. So what is it? What kind of subject are you looking for? Do you need to stop down your aperture to get that depth of field, or can you get away with a shallow depth of field? In this case, here, this is New York City High Line, and this was shot about 2 hours after sunset. And believe it or not, there is a significant amount of light, even though to your eyes it doesn't look like it. I have light coming from inside the building, light from underneath the benches, and some extra highlights from all these tree lights that are going on. So the first thing I'm thinking about here isn't shutter speed, it isn't ISO, it's aperture. And the reasoning why is depth of field. I am very close to this bench. I'm about probably 10 to 11 inches from that bench, so it's extremely close. But the buildings in the background are very far off. So my aperture, I know right away when I have that subject that's really close and the subject that's super far away, I need to stop down my aperture to increase my depth of field. So I shot this at f16 to increase that depth of field. One other thing before I go any further, now that I got to some images, you'll notice in the bottom right-hand corner, you'll see what lens I use for every single image. So I put every single there. So if you have a question like, oh, why did you use the 10 to 24 in that one? Or why did you use the 24 to 70? You can reference that and say, there was the lens. But then here, this is a different scene, totally different situation, where before it was about depth of field. I needed depth of field, and they're still at night. So this is the Korean War Memorial in Washington, D.C. I usually, in this situation, I kind of walk around to look at the subject, to see what's going on, and to kind of not just look at the subject and see where the best light is, but what's going on in the background. Unfortunately, in Washington, D.C., almost no matter what time of night you go, it's going to be busy with either lights and people and stuff like that, people selling stuff. So what do I want to do? I want to minimize my depth of field. Not so much because it's dark. I'm not worried about that because the previous image was dark, but I stopped down the aperture. This is about shallow depth of field. I want to make the soldiers in the background softer, the lights in the background, and the trees in the background softer, more out of focus, so they're less of a distraction. Your eye will go to two things, the brightest spots of the scene or the sharpest parts of the scene. And in this case, making him sharp, I'm hoping, because there's some contrast on him, that because I made him the sharpest part of the scene, your eye goes to him and the background becomes less distracting. So these are the cases where I'm thinking about, okay, what's the first thing I need to control my camera? And that was aperture. Then there's situations where it's shutter speed is the first thing I'm thinking about, and for a couple of reasons. First, a lot of people think about shutter speed and either stopping action with a very fast shutter speed or creating a motion blur in water and in waterfalls and stuff like that by having a very slow shutter speed. So the faster, 1/1000th of a second, you're freezing action. The slower, 1/2, you're getting movement. But what's happening when it comes to light in those situations as well? The faster the shutter that opens and closes in your camera or turns on and off on a mirrorless, the less light hits from the scene that you're pointing at, hits your sensor. The longer that shutter speed is, 1/2 of a second, the more light, the more it can absorb from the scene. So in a case like this, f16, because you'll see in a second, I'm using f16 because I need depth of field. I have a very close subject in the foreground and subjects in the background. Back to New York City High Line, f16 at 1.6 seconds. It seems like a lot of time because especially when you're standing there and you press a button in New York City and all you hear is click, and then you actually count in yourself 1, 2, and you're like, oh, I better get out of here because this is taking way too long. But in this case, it's very safe on top of the Highland, so you're good to go. But 1.6 seconds isn't that long. It's long enough to get some exposure in the lights in the bushes and the lights underneath the bench and some of the lights of the buildings in the background, but everything else is super, super dark. So here, F16, now I'm going to 13 seconds. Long time. The shutter is open, and what does it do? It's absorbing more light. The light is hitting that sensor, creating a better exposure. And now you can see why I chose F16. That bench is about 1.5 feet from me, so I need that depth of field. Not quite the proper exposure yet. The best exposure so far you see is right there underneath that light and in these bushes, but the rest still underexposed. I end up going to 15 seconds. Now we're getting a better proper exposure in the scene. You're starting to see the buildings more, everything's starting to happen. And then you can go even further and go to 20 seconds. And this is where what you're trying to create in the image comes into play, in the sense of, for me, this is slightly overexposed for a night scene. It's just a little bit too much. It's starting to look a little bit like daylight. In some scenes, that's okay, but because this is a city scene in New York City, the darker is, to me, a little bit better. I might go maybe 17 seconds and brighten it up just a hair, but the darker in this scene turns out to be a little bit better. One of the interesting things about long exposures as well is you can make subjects disappear that walk through your scene. And what do I mean by that is, when your shutter opens and somebody walks through the scene, they tend to disappear. But there's a couple of factors with that. This is a New York City High Line, and it is very, very busy, especially on warm days. So you actually see this person here, the person sitting down and her stroller, and that's because she's barely moving, but the stroller, you can see, has a little bit of movement blur to her. Sorry about that. And that's because she's pushing it back and forth just a little bit. But where is everybody else? If you look really carefully, there's a leg right in this foreground, and I'll go to the next one really quickly, and you can see there's this kind of ghost-like effect of people, and that's because of this light down here. And the fact when you walk and you plant your foot, it actually stops for a split second, and that light hits it and it captures on your sensor. The people walking further away in the dark don't show up at all. As long as that shutter stays open and then they keep walking, they disappear. If somebody walked into the scene and stood right where you see these legs here, I'm not sure if you can see my cursor or not, but there's a pair of legs right here. If this person stopped and stood there for 5 seconds, they would look like a ghost. If they stopped for 10 seconds, they would look a little bit more density to them. And that's because they're capturing them. But because they're just walking, they disappear. But everybody else in the dark where no light's hitting them, they're not there at all. It's kind of a neat effect of long exposures as well. So long exposures in movement. So not just letting in light, like I said, it captures movement. So when you're shooting the stars and at night, and you're out there in Rocky Mountain National State Park where this is, and the clouds start streaming in, taking away all your stars, guess what you're gonna get? You're gonna get movement in those clouds. And I'm okay with that, depending on the type of image that you're trying to create. You know, the stars are starting to go away. There's nothing really too exciting going on in the foreground anyway. To make it a little bit more interesting of an image, I purposely captured that movement in the clouds and tried to create something just a little bit different in sense of the scene that's there. And the longer you go, excuse me for 1 second, the longer you go with your exposure, even with stars, the more movement you're going to capture. And I'm going to go into capturing pinpointed stars and the Milky Way a little bit later in more detail, because it's all about time. And time that the shutter is open, how long can it go before you start seeing that movement in the stars? And it all relates to your focal length. You know, the more telephoto you go, the shorter amount of time that you have before you get movement. But no matter what focal length you use, I'll take it on my throat. No matter what focal length you use, when you start going into the minutes or hours in a scene with stars, you start getting longer and longer star trails. And that's a fun technique to try. Unfortunately, this was Arches National Park, and I tried 5 straight shots to capture a long exposure. And the longest I got was 17 minutes because every single time a set of hikers with headlamps would walk into my frame and ruin the picture. So the longest I was able to get was 17 minutes. But the one thing to think about when doing star trails is the direction you're facing as well. When you face north, everything is going to circular around the North Star. So you get the circular effect, a pinpoint in the middle, and everything revolves around that. When you face south, you get multiple directions in the star. So you get kind of a curve on top, a curve on bottom, and a curve on the sides. When you face east or west, you get a diagonal movement depending on what direction you're facing. You'll get the opposite diagonal movement. So knowing which direction you're going for star trails will dictate what kind of star trail you get. Third, and to be honest with you, the last thing with night photography that I worry about in the sense of exposure is ISO. I first think about either shutter speed. Do I have to freeze action, or do I need a longer shutter speed, or do I need a shorter shutter speed for stars? Do I need depth of field, or do I need less depth of field? So aperture and shutter come first, and then I start setting my ISO accordingly. And thankfully with digital photography, the days of having to stay around 400 or lower or 800 and lower are starting to disappear very quickly. Digital photography has opened up ISOs like 3200, 6400 and higher, and being good quality images. In the past, I grew up with T-Max 3200, processing black and white T-Max 3200. And every time I need something a little bit more artsy with a ton of grain, that was the film that I took out. You know, you're being all artistic with all that grain. But 3200 today, that's starting to disappear completely, and very acceptable images, which allowed for this increase in night and especially star photography. So here, obviously, this is, I'll be honest with everybody right now, I wish I was right here. This is Barbados, Whole Town, a little beach in where we stayed a couple of years ago. Super bright day, can shoot at ISO 100, have a shutter speed of 125 easily, and an aperture of f11, f16, so I have nice depth of field. When you have tons of light, that ISO can stay down. But as things change, and depending on the equipment you have and the conditions of the scene you have, you may have to start bumping up that ISO. This is just before sunrise in Joshua Tree National Park, and I had left my tripod in the car. And unfortunately, we were scouting around, and I just grabbed the camera and started walking off into the Joshua trees. But I came to this one where I knew I needed a large depth of field. You know, I needed this foreground element in focus and all the trees in the background in focus, so I had to stop down. The other was that, I was hand holding, and I can hand hold at a relatively slow speed at 24 millimeters down to about 1/8 of a second, knowing, okay, that's the slowest shutter speed that I can hand hold with the vibration compensation of the 24 to 70. So I need the depth of field f16. I need to be about 1/8 of a second or so with this particular lens. So the third thing, to get the proper exposure, ISO 800, rounded out that exposure correctly. Here, it's about light in your scene. This is Yosemite National Park, El Capitan, on a crescent moon night. And it's amazing when you let your eyes adjust in a very dark place like Yosemite National Park on a crescent moon. It is pretty amazing how much light that moon reflects off of it, even not even being a full moon. You give yourself 5-10 minutes and all of a sudden it looks like dusk, that it reflects so much light. And that's what kind of makes some images pretty interesting, is you kind of take this exposure where it looks like sunlight is hitting El Capitan, but these deep shadows and the stars give it away that is still night. And it almost looks like a composite, like I cut out El Capitan from one image and the stars from another and placed them together. It's just one scene. The other thing with this that's interesting, this is shot at ISO 1600, f 2.8 or 3.5, somewhere around there, 2.8 or 3.5, not any more stop down than that. I think it's about a 10-second exposure. And you might be thinking to yourself, or might not, that before you said f2.8 is a shallow depth of field. But here in the foreground, the trees are in focus, El Capitan's in focus, and the stars, which are further than anything else away, are in focus. That's because wide-angle lenses like the 15 to 30 have an infinity point that's relatively close. It's usually somewhere 7, 8, 9, 10 feet is where your infinity focus point is. That means it's not going to focus anywhere past it. That's your point of focus. If all the subjects in the scene, looking through your viewfinder, are beyond the infinity point, you can open up your aperture and everything will be in focus. The change comes, say there's a tree right in front of me, 2 feet in front of me, that I want to capture, as well as El Capitan, which is much further away, and the stars. That's when your aperture and depth of field has a problem. Like the bench shot. The bench is really close and the buildings are very far away. That's when you have a problem. If everything was far away in the city scene, beyond that infinity point, I could have opened up to 2.8. So hopefully that makes some sense. I will give my email address and everything at the end if people want to ask more questions, or we'll try to get to those questions at the end as well here. But then there's nights where there's no moon whatsoever. There's no extra light being reflected off the moon. It's a dark night. And that's where the ISO has to go up even further to get the proper exposure. I'm going to give you a quick reference of what the exposure was for this, but go into more detail about that exposure in a little bit. So basically, from past experience and a general setting, when I go out to shoot the Milky Way, I'm going to shoot with the widest angle lens possible, because I want to maximize the amount of sky I get. I want it as wide as possible. I'm going to open up my aperture as wide as possible, f2.8. Hopefully you have that. If you have faster, even better. But then I'm going to go to a shutter speed of about 25 seconds and an ISO of 3200. That would be an exposure for a night like this where there's no moon and you're trying to get the Milky Way. So ISO 3200, 25 seconds, f2.8, and the widest lens you possibly have. Hopefully it's a 15 to 30 millimeter by camera. That's the only plug you'll get today. So what's in my camera bag at any given time when I'm shooting at night photography? Lenses, like I said, a wide angle, fast wide angles as much as possible, no matter what, APS-C or full frame, even mirrorless. These wide angles are the key. But I do carry like a prime lens that's really fast because it gives extra light, and telephoto lenses as well. You know, normal lenses or maybe even more telephoto, depending. Is it going to be a city scene or is it, you know, a landscape scene? So it all depends. I carry the gamut. I usually do not use any filters at night, especially circular polarizers or neutral density filters. And the reasoning why is that they let in less light. They have density to them. So they let in, as in circular polarizers, a stop and a half less light. And when you're talking low light situations, you know, if I don't have to go another 2 stops of light, I don't want to, because it takes time enough. Neutral density is the same way. They do make specific filters for night skies, and mostly to deal with both atmospheric haze, and if you have extra city lights, like if you're doing a Milky Way shot and you know you're close to a town, they have filters that can help filter out some of that light as well. I usually don't use them. Most of the stuff I do is in post-production. I'll talk about that a little bit as we go along. Accessories that are a must. A very, very good tripod that Looking Glass can help you out with if you don't have one. They are a must. And when I say a good one, a good sturdy one. More often than not, I see people going out at night with very lightweight tripods with cameras that they shouldn't be putting them on, because it's hard enough at night that having some of these lighter weight tripods can cause issues that can get very expensive. Shutter release cable or a remote for your camera. You do not want to touch your camera during long exposures. So having a shutter release cable or a remote to hit that shutter release, that would be ideal. Flashlights, not only for your safety of getting to and from the place you're taking your pictures, but also to do painting with light. I'll go into that a little bit later. So why wide angle? So now I'm going to go into using certain lenses. Wide angle, like here, the New York City High Line again, it's because I'm in a tight space. I want to maximize the area, but it's also for the effect of having that foreground look bigger, having this area look wider than it is. This is only about 6 or 8 feet wide, but using that focal length to make it look wider, bigger, and stretched out and longer than it actually is. So I'm very particular thinking about what focal lengths I want to use for what. You can use wide to normal lenses as well, like the 24-70, but realize with the sky, I prefer to use that 15-30 or 10-24 wide angle because I want to maximize the sky. In this scene, I'm reducing the amount of sky because I can only go to 24. Does it work? Sure, absolutely. Have I shot multiple shots with it? Absolutely. But when I know I'm going for the Milky Way, I definitely go for that little bit wider. So I talked about telephoto shots for night photography. It's not just wide. Thinking about what you want in a scene. This is the World War II memorial in the foreground and the Lincoln Memorial in the background. I shot this with an older lens, a Tamron, a few years back at 300 millimeters, purposely. And where I'm standing, I'm actually standing on the grass of the Washington Monument across the street from the World War II Memorial. And the reason why I chose 300 millimeters is to fill a good majority of the frame with the Lincoln Memorial. Where wide angle stretches things out, telephoto gives that compression effect. It brings foreground and background subjects closer together. And that's what I wanted to do. I didn't want the Lincoln Memorial to look like a dot in the background. I wanted it to fill the frame. And a curious thing with light with a scene like this was handheld at 300 millimeters at 1/15 of a second. And he's like, how the heck? I think my ISO was 1600 on this particular scene, and there actually is a lot of light in this frame. There's a lot of light being reflected off of the Lincoln Memorial. There's a lot of light coming from World War II, and that's how I was able to get a fast enough shutter speed to actually handhold this. And of course, prime lenses. Prime lenses I love for cityscapes and walking around cities at night. One, because they're fast. They're usually sub f2.0, f8, 1.8, or 1.4, which lets in more light so you can get those faster shutter speeds, but they're also smaller and compact than some of these other lenses. That allows you to keep a smaller bag and a little bit more incognito type bag when walking around cities and stuff like that. This is actually one of this Bourbon Street Blues bar and club. It's a jazz club in Nashville, Tennessee. If you ever get yourself to Nashville, Tennessee, it is Printer's Alley, I believe the roadway is called. Usually, any night they're open, they have a great blues or jazz band that you can check out. Fun place to go to. Other lenses, all-in-ones. I know some people think, oh, you can't use all-in-ones at night. They're variable aperture. They don't let in enough light. But under the right circumstances and with the right equipment, I'm not so worried at times. In this case, this is a little bit dusky. The sun had set about 45 minutes earlier. There was still enough light coming off of the Vietnam Memorial that I was able to shoot with this. And when it gets really, really dark, that's when I take out my tripod and keep shooting as well. I'm going to come back to this image a little later and go through a couple of other things with it. So now, what's the difference between blue sky, black sky, and dusk? Well, everybody knows sunset. That's when everybody goes out to shoot. And this is the Junction Bridge in Zion National Park. So during this scene, I'm on the bridge, and to my left and to my right, there's about 35 of my closest friends that I shoot with every day here at the Junction Bridge in Zion National Park. at sunset. The best thing about 15 minutes from now is that the sun's going to set and 90% of these people are going to disappear. They're just going to go. They're going to go back to their hotels. They're going to go eat dinner, do whatever they're going to do. And you start getting the park to yourself, and you start getting wherever you are to yourself after sunset. So I go driving around. I come back about 90 minutes to 2 hours later. And that is still what they call like a blue hour. And the reason why it's called a blue hour is because the sky still has some ambient light in it. Even though I came back and stood there on the bridge, and to my eye, it is extremely dark. It's another crescent moon night because you can see all this light in the valley. It's giving off some, and I can see this fairly well, but to me, the sky looks black. But because it's only 90 minutes or 2 hours past sunset, the sun hasn't gone beneath the horizon far enough that it's gone black. It's giving off some of that light, and with a long enough exposure, in this case, 20 seconds, it turns this indigo blue. So really understanding the times that you're going out to photograph to what the sky is going to look like. And one of the great apps that you can get is Photo Pills. It's a really fantastic app, and it uses augmented reality as well, where you can go to the bridge during the day and hold it up to the scene you want to take a picture of, and it'll give you the moon track and the sun track of where the sun and moon is, and where golden hour is, where blue hour is, and where dark hour is. So it helps you understand that, okay, if the sun set at 7:15, up until about 9:30, 10 o'clock, I could probably get this indigo blue sky. From 11 o'clock till about 3:30 in the morning, I'm going to have a dark sky. So it can tell you when you go out to get the effects that you want. Like here, this is now about 2 o'clock in the morning, same location, just pointing a slightly different direction, because now we went back because the solar system center is now kind of rising. The Milky Way's galactic core, they call it, sorry about that, has risen up above the mountains, and we went back. But because it's so late in the night, all that ambient light is gone. And now I have that dark, dark sky, that black sky. So remember, depending on what time you go out, will dictate what color that sky becomes. Just remember, it's not just after sunset, but also as morning starts coming and the sun is going to start to rise, that sky's going to get bluer and bluer and bluer again. So, in between those two blue hours, you got the dark hour. Make your scene interesting. Don't walk away just after one picture. Use leading lines, focal points, scale, and color to make up your composition. Here's a pretty simple scene. This is Teton National Park. I believe it's Jenny Lake, I want to say. So I don't think it's Jackson Lake. I think it's Jenny Lake. And this scene, it had a nice silhouette of the mountains in the background. And the lake had a somewhat okay reflection, but half of it was choppy and half of it was smooth. So, it just didn't have the greatest of reflections. I ended up pointing away from the Milky Way to take the shot. And in the right-hand corner, I was hoping it would show up in the initial shot a little bit better. But this floating boardwalk here, this floating dock, ended up just looking muddy. And I wanted it as a leading line coming in from the right side, leading into the lake, into the silhouetted mountains, but it just looked like a black mass there. It wasn't too great. And this is where I talked about earlier, using your flashlight to paint with light. This is about a 20 to 25 second exposure, and for about 8 to 10 seconds of that, I threw some light onto this dock. So it gave it a little bit more dimension, and it looks a little more like a leading line. It's a little better that way. So just adding a small element sometimes can add a little bit dimension, a little bit more depth to the image. I got a little shooting star up here in the top right-hand corner as well. That's kind of cool whenever that happens. So that's a lot of fun. The difference, though, to let you know, the difference between like a shooting star and a plane, because the lights are blinking, you'll see that blinking. It'll look like a a straight solid line, but there'll be blinking highlights in it, and you know right away that's a plane. Shooting stars are just going to kind of have a tail and get solid and rounded at one end. So, you know, you'll know the difference between right away between a shooting star and a plane. Back to this image. I told you I was going to come back to this because this talks about leading lines and focal points. I initially started shooting this image, and this guy in the bottom center right here, he wasn't there. And the images were okay. You know, it was, you know, the Vietnam Memorial with the Washington Monument in the background. But he came over to my right side, and I saw him standing there. And as you know, I stopped for a second. He asked, "Can I walk into the frame?" I go, "Sure, sure." I go, "But do you mind if I take a picture of you?" And he said, "Absolutely not." So as soon as he walked in and kneeled down and put his finger to the wall, I started shooting. And that's where my focal point came in. It's nice leading lines with the lights and the reflections of light back up to the Washington Monument, but the line back down to him gives you that focus point, gives much more powerful an image. It also gives an anchor point to the image as well. So use leading lines and focus points, but also try to create scale. Have fun with that, because wide angle, what does it do? Foreground's large, background smaller. This is a St. Louis arch. I got really close and down to the left side of it, making it look much bigger than the city itself. It's a big structure, but when you look at it, because our eyes don't see wide angle like this, they kind of see things more in like a 45mm focal length, because as soon as you look through the viewfinder, you get this distorted, gigantic effect in making it look smaller. So have fun with scale as well. Work with foreground and background elements that way. Some night skies tips: set your lens to manual focus. And we're going to get into this a little bit more. I'll explain all that as we get into other stuff. Shutter release cables, if you have a shutter release cable doing long exposures, always have some sort of Velcro or gaffer's tape with you, both for your lens and for shutter release cables if you're doing extended that, and I'll go into that a little bit more. Turn your VC off, your image stabilization, your vibration reduction, turn that off, because as soon as you put your camera and lens on a tripod, on a steady platform, it's going to look for vibration. When it doesn't find it, it'll create its own. So definitely turn that off so you don't get any motion blur. Know what you want to shoot before you shoot it. Go out and scout, please. If you have the opportunity to, in a national park or wherever you might go out scout during the day in the light, so you know what you're dealing with and you know the elements that you have to work with. You know, not just for your safety, but what is it you want in your scene and don't want in your scene. And of course, be patient. Have everything you need handy and know where it is in your bag. I can tell you, when I go out to shoot night skies or night photography, I know where every lens is, what compartment. It's always in the same place, where my batteries are, where my flashlight is, where my media is. Everything is always in the same place because I don't want to go digging around for it. It may sound kind of little hyper, but it is for a specific reason that I just want to grab it. I don't want to look for it because more often than not, I'm a little klutzy. I do not want to pick something out of my bag and not be it and accidentally drop it, and then I don't know where it is, what it was, and that just becomes a problem. White balance, setting your white balance. You can manually set your white balance if you want. And if you're shooting the Milky Way or moonlight or dark sky, these are some of the settings as in Kelvin. Milky Way is usually about 3,900. If you shoot in RAW and you have the ability to do that RAW conversion, you know, you can shoot in auto white balance if you want and then set your white balance later on, for sure. I shoot both in JPEG and RAW, mainly because I like to just quickly look at the JPEGs. And when you shoot in JPEG, it embeds the color profile, it embeds the saturation, everything into it. And you see it. And that's just why I shoot both. And I like to set my white balance in the field. Do you have to? If you're shooting RAW, absolutely not. I just do it because that's the way I prefer to just do it. So, which leads me to what the images will look like when they come out of your camera, especially when shooting the Milky Way. When you're shooting the Milky Way and you're out there, you're probably going to have the wow factor effect if you haven't done it before. that everybody has. And it's one of the funnest things leading night skies workshops is that first time people shoot and get the Milky Way in the scene. Every single one of them do the wow. I did it. Everybody does it because it's exciting and fun. But it's not going to look exactly like this. Unfortunately, because of atmospheric haze, most images, no matter how you have it set in camera, is going to look a little bit duller, not as contrasty. The color's not going to be as saturated, unless you do some of these presets in your camera. Then you can get it to look anywhere you want. But I leave the presets alone. I want to do all the correction possible. So every single image that you've seen that I've presented so far, and we'll see as we go along here, has been manipulated, has been worked on. And one of them is a great feature, is called dehaze. It takes out that atmospheric haze. And that's why I don't use the filter on the front. You can, it works well. I've just gotten into a routine of using Photoshop or Lightroom to take out the haze. So anytime you see a Milky Way shot, 99.9% of the chances are that they've been manipulated. So, you know, it's just a matter of making it work. Also, be creative and have fun. You know, you're not always going to have the ideal situations. This is Apalachicola. Instead of creating a sunburst, here I had a 3/4 moon. I purposely stopped down my aperture. And when you stop down your aperture, that means the opening is really small. It forces that light source through a small opening, which creates this burst effect. It also allowed me to do about a 25-second exposure in this particular scene because I wanted to flatten out the Gulf. I was in Apalachicola for this scene. So just did a little bit different, because when you have this kind of a moon, that Milky Way gets washed out because the light is just so bright. So it really wasn't so much a Milky Way night. It was just a night photography on the beach type of shot. Work the scene. Don't just take one. This night at the High Line, I must have walked up and down this High Line for 2 hours looking for different scenes. You've seen these two already. And not every scene is going to be perfect, but still take the shot anyway. Try to get something out of it, even if it's you're just like, well, this element's here, this. Work the scene, because you never know what you might come across. And ultimately, this is probably the last shot I took that night. And this is a few years back. And the next day we were at Photo Plus Expo in New York City. I'm going through the images with some of my friends, and every single one of them said, that's my favorite. This one here, this is my favorite. And for me, it was the last shot I took. I was just going home, just doing one last shot. And I didn't think much of it. And sometimes you got to listen to your friends. If that many people like it, I guess it's a good shot. So I still like it, but not as much as some of the other ones I took that night. But people still seem to like it. Okay, now getting to some details of focusing at night. All right, so because of manual, you know, you got to take over your camera, you know, shutter priority, aperture priority is not really going to work that well. When shooting for the stars and the Milky Way like this, autofocus is not going to work. It's just not going to happen. It's not going to be your friend. So you're going to have to go into manual focus. And there's two techniques that we use, depending on the cameras that you have. Some of the newer cameras have a live view feature. Well, most of them have a live view feature, but have a live view feature that is very useful in low light situations. So what we do here is we set up our cameras, we set our exposures, we do everything, and we kind of get the crop and the angle that we want to shoot at, and we find the brightest star, this one kind of in the middle right here, the brightest star, and we turn on live view. And you don't zoom your lens, not the lens, leave the lens exactly where it is, but in live view, use the zoom buttons on the back of your camera to zoom in the live view to this star. And what's going to happen, more often than not, the star is going to look really fuzzy. But as you turn the focus ring, it'll either get more fuzzy, that means you go in the wrong direction. So turn the other way, it'll get sharper and sharper and sharper and sharper. And the reason why I say a lot of the cameras today, you can use this technique. It works because they control the gain really well. That's where you can see things in lower light. It's kind of noise for video. Some of the older cameras don't control gain that well, so it's a little bit more difficult. If you're in that situation, This is sort of a trial and error type of situation you got into, because you're going to have to go to you're going to have to go to the infinity point. It's that sideways figure 8. And what I say is just put it right in the middle of that and take a test shot. It'll either be dead on or it won't. You know, sometimes you might get lucky and you got it. Chances are it's going to be slightly out of focus. So you take your picture, play the picture on the back of your screen, and then zoom into the star. You'll know right away if it's soft. What you're going to have to do is just slightly turn the focus ring one direction or the other, and it'll either get softer or it'll get sharper. If it gets sharper, just go a little bit more that direction. If it goes softer, you know you're going to have to go the opposite direction. I wish there was a more scientific way to do it, but you know, those two techniques tend to be the most. Of course, in night scenes, when you're doing city scenes, autofocus can work fairly well, especially when you have contrast. And in this scene, you know, I got plenty of contrast that I can focus right down here, autofocus. But if the lights go dimmer, and it gets darker here where autofocus starts getting a little sketchy because autofocus needs contrast, I take out my flashlight and I create my own contrast. So if this down here, say that about 6 feet into the walkway is my focus point, I'll take my flashlight and flash it onto that area and either manual focus, or if I have a bright enough flashlight and it creates enough contrast, I'll autofocus right on that point. So the only thing I'll do is, I'm going to go back to this. Once I have the scene and I know I'm going to take a couple of pictures of it and I know I got my focus sharp, that's where I'm going to take my tape. I'm going to tape down that focus ring. Because it's dark, you never know. You just don't want to hit anything, throw it off, and then take 4 or 5 images all being out of focus. So the Milky Way 500 rule, we're winding down here, getting down to, okay, you threw out numbers earlier, f2.8, 15 millimeters, 25 seconds at ISO 3200. How do you get this time, how long I can keep a shutter open depending on what focal length I use, because that's what it's determined by. The wider the angle, the longer you can keep your shutter open. The more telephoto, because of magnification, the shorter the time you can keep your shutter open before you get movement in the pinpointed stars. So think of it this way. If you take 15 millimeters and divide it into 500, you get roughly 33.3 seconds. I've honestly found out that is a bit too long, but it brings you within the ballpark of the range that we're talking about. There's a couple of more things that are added in, declination, which is based off of the solar equator. I'm not a mathematician. I'm not doing math in the field. I don't want to, so just get me close and I'll work it out from there. So 15 into 30 gives you 33.3. Like I said, more often than not, that's a little too long. It ends up being somewhere between 20 and 25 seconds, depending on what you're doing. But it's also, if you want to zoom in a little bit more, you want to just get the galactic core in the scene, and you use a 50 millimeter lens or a 45 millimeter lens, say 50 in the 500, that's about 10 seconds. Because of magnification, the time your shutter can stay open becomes shorter. So that's the important key, is depending on the focal length, how long you can keep your shutter open. This is where PhotoPills comes in super, super handy again. There is a section where you can put in your focal length, your declination, and it'll tell you if you'll get pinpointed stars or how long the streaks will be, depending on how long of an exposure that you do. So that's where that comes in super, super handy as well. And here's the 50 into 500, gives you 10 seconds. So accessories and flashlights. This is the last section, so I'll go through this. Things that are important. One is a flashlight. I showed you this scene before. No flashlight, new moon, no extra light. But to give a little bit more dimension, a little bit more texture to this image, I took out my flashlight, moved back a little bit, slightly different angle, and added just a little bit of light to the rock to the right. But I didn't add it from directly behind the camera, because what is that going to do? If you ever take light and from behind a camera, say your flash, ever notice if you shoot it right out of subject, it becomes a little on the flat side, unless you bounce it off something. You make it more directional. The same thing with this. You don't want to do the flashlight from behind the camera. Go off to the side, 15, 20 feet. You're doing a 20, 25 second exposure anyway. You have plenty of time to do it. So here I went about 20 feet to my right, brought it in from an angle so you have highlights and shadows, makes it much more dimensional. Tripods and shutter release cables. I can't say this enough. Go to Looking Glass. They'll set you up with great stuff, because out there you're on unlevel ground, lots of rocks or whatever it might be. You want to keep your camera gear safe and you want as little movement as possible. You may think by pressing that shutter release, even with the self-timer or whatever, you're not creating any movement. Be very, very careful. You know, I do not touch my camera with long exposures any more than I have to. So tripods and shutter release cables, extremely, extremely important. And prep. Make sure your batteries are charged. You're going to be out there for a long time. This isn't 15-minute, 30-minute photography. You're out there for hours. You don't need tons of memory cards, but bring them anyway. You never know how much you're going to shoot. Good tripod, shutter release cable, waters and snacks, because this is a patience game. You're not shooting a lot, and you're not shooting a lot very fast, but you're there for a long time. You do not want to get grumpy and thirsty, so have snacks and water with you. Glow sticks. It may seem funny. We're not raving or doing dancing with them. What you're going to do is, especially if you have to hike in any significant amount of ways, is what I tend to do, because this is personal experience, is I crack a glow stick and I either put it on my windshield or hang it from the antenna of the car. And the reasoning why, it just helps you, no matter how good you are with direction, you can always make a wrong turn. It just helps you spot your car, know where it is, and know where to get back to. It's just a directional thing in this case. No matter what the weather is, always dress in warmer. You can always take stuff off. So dress warm. Again, don't want to get cranky out there. You want to stay out there and be comfortable and shoot great images, because it's meant to be fun, not stressful. I want to thank you guys for coming. You see my email address there. If you do have more questions past the ones that we answer now, feel free to ask me any questions. You can check me out on Facebook or Instagram. I'm on Facebook a little bit more, but you can check me out anywhere. I'll be more than happy to continue conversations as we go. So hopefully, I see Ben is still muted there. Now he's coming back.
Here I am.
Yes, there he is.
Yeah, I was just going through, going back over some of the questions that we had for you. Lots of questions, so we'll try to get to all of these.
Okay.
When using the 500 rule, do you need to factor in sensor size?
Yeah, that is a magnification issue as well. And to go further, just Google magnification and crop sensor and 500 rule. You'll get, there's so much on the internet about it, but it'll help you get there. But yeah, you do have to account for crop sensor as well.
Okay. Someone wanted to, we'd move past it, and I wasn't sure. The Washington Memorial shot, what lens you used for that one? I thought it was either 24-70 or 15-30, but
the Washington Memorial, which let's go back. This oh, this one, 18-400, I think, is the one that we're talking about here. Let's
and
see.
What about the wall?
The wall, yeah, that's where I'm going to. Where did it go? Oh, this one? You think it's that one?
I think it's this one.
This one, yeah. This is the 18-400 at 18 millimeters, handheld. So 18-400. And again, using the wall itself, I kind of leaned into, help me get a little slower shutter speed and stuff, and handhold it. Yep, 18-400.
And then another question here about how bright is your flashlight? And then earlier we had a question about the amount that you use a flash, off-camera flash, I'm assuming.
Okay, yeah, flash very rarely at night, for the most part. If there's going to be, I know I'm particularly shooting a person that I need a little fill flash in, I might, but very, very rarely. The flashlight I use is very bright. It's Phoenix brand. It's an Phenix. There is Surefire as well. I try to get the brightest flashlights I can and sturdy ones, ones that will last and are a little bit more on the cleaner white light side. These flashlights tend to have different modes as well, different brightness modes. The Phoenix has 4 different ones, so if I need more or less, I can adjust it as well.
Okay, another question here. Sorry, I'm trying to mute myself so that we don't hear the bird hears me talking. So of course he's going to town upstairs. Long exposures as long as 15 minutes, 30 minutes, or even an hour. Have you ever done those? You'd mentioned earlier that having a cable release or remote is better than actually pressing buttons, shutter release on the camera. Is that what you would use? What kind of, is there additional tech that you would need to use in order to keep, I mean, I would imagine that's essentially, isn't that bulb, you're just leaving the shutter open?
Yeah, because most cameras, you can go to 30 seconds and then you'll get a bulb feature. Most cameras, you can hit the shutter and it'll release it for, up to 30 seconds. Beyond 30 seconds, it's what's called bulb, where you have to manually keep it open yourself. And for the older cameras that you actually have a cable that you screw in to it, like my Nikon D850, what you do is I use the shutter release cable, you press it down, it fires it, and it actually has a lock on the side. And you can lock it and it'll keep that shutter open for as long as you want. 10 minutes, 15 minutes, 2 hours, as long as you want to go. If your camera doesn't have one of these features, or the remote you have for the infrared remote, they do make, and I just lost the terminology for it, they do make mechanisms that you can use your hot shoe and will plug into your camera that will fire the shutter for you, but also fire it in the same way using that bulb feature, and you can keep it open for as long as you want. Oh my God, now I lost it. Nikon cameras have it built in. Accelerometer, is that what I'm thinking? Yeah, but either way, Looking Glass will know because I'm having intervalometer. There you go. Thank you. Wow. Some of these days you have these brain fades, but yeah, you can buy external intervalometers for camera systems that don't have them built in, and you can do time lapses with them. You can do long exposures with them. I kind of recommend going that way, especially if you're going to delve into night photography. Is investing in an intervalometer because it'll give you a lot more features that you can work with, besides just long exposures, time lapse, all that stuff. So.
Excellent, thank you. Another question is, what do you do regarding battery power when you're out there? I know you said you listed batteries as being something you want to make sure to have. If you're out there, I mean, I know that you do some of these that last several days, they're overnight, they're assuming that you have some way you're recharging batteries, but if you're out on the grind for several hours, do the batteries last? How do you go about making sure that you never run out of battery power?
Well, I got tons of batteries. I usually have 6 backup batteries with me, for one. 2 is if it's colder, keeping them warm. And make sure they are inside my jacket pockets against, where the heat is, keeping them warm, not letting them drain because of cold. But I also do have an inverter for the car. So what you do is it plugs right into the cigarette lighter, or you can attach it to a battery. So if you have like a secondary battery that you just happen to have in your car, what it does is it attaches to that, and you can plug in your chargers, and while you're out shooting, you can charge your batteries, and if you need be, go back to it. And what's great today, inverters used to be very expensive. Now you can find them really good ones for 40-50 bucks. If that person wants to email me, I will send you, off the top of my head, I don't remember the brand I have, but it's really good and not very expensive. So having an inverter that either plugs into your lighter or something like that will help. You can charge in the field as well. So.
And then another question here, maybe the last for now, folks. Okay. Anybody else that has questions, you can throw them in the chat over here. We're reading them off. Somebody had mentioned they have a point and shoot right now. They haven't upgraded to like a DSLR or anything yet. Wondering what you would recommend for anybody on a lower grade camera, like a point and shoot camera.
To shoot night photography or to
Yeah.
upgrade? Ooh, it all depends on the point and shoot. I mean,
It's a Lumix, I think she said.
okay, if you have manual settings,
Yeah.
then you can do it, because usually, the Lumixes tend to, or point and shoots tend to have wider angle lenses to begin with, just because of the size of the sensor. But you may have some issues with the aperture and the ISO setting, depending on how well it handles noise. But if you have manual settings in it, I know I do have a point and shoot myself, but it has a full manual mode. You can go back and use those settings that I gave you. Go to the widest angle of view, open the aperture as wide as possible, and use about a 20-second exposure if you can go that long for night skies. For street scenes or city scenes, usually there is plenty of light that you can work with. You just might have slower shutter speeds, and you might need a little tripod to like prop it up on, just so you get sharp images, depending on what you're doing. But depending on the camera, it's all going to be how far you can go with it. Yeah.
That's a good question, though, because I
Yeah.
think it's probably 85 people in the group. I'm sure not all of them had DSLRs, and wanting to. There's the old saying, always master what you've got, and the concept of photography before building.
And usually, if you do that, you realize, okay, I want to take this a little bit further, and then you start stepping into some other stuff. But if that person is still here too, and they want to email me a little further with more details of the camera that they have, sure. Or I'm sure, if they want to contact Looking Glass, they can help them out as well.
Yeah. Any other questions? Anybody? We had there was one question that was a few people following some interest in the photo pills.
Photo pills, yes.
And then one came back and asked if there was a free version, because it would appear it was $10 to download.
Yeah, it's like $9.99. I will admit the $10 has made it well worth it at times, because especially with the augmented reality part of it, going even out for sunset, you can position yourself in an area and see where the sun is going to track. And if you want it to go exactly behind a certain area, with that augmented reality, you can position yourself 2-3 feet to the right or left and know, I need to be over here, not over there, to get the sun exactly, or the moon or the Milky Way exactly where I want it. So that's where sometimes, it may be $10, but I believe there's also tutorials on it. There's so much to it. It's one of those, I usually don't push too many things like that, but in this case, it has a bunch of stuff that are handy for sure.
Well, since I can't type that fast and you just finished answering that question, perfect time. We have a question from Charlotte, and I'm just going to let you answer this one. Do we make lenses for the Sony E-mount, Ken?
We do make lenses for the Sony E-mount, both full frame and APS-C. The FE, the full frame versions, we have primes 20, 24, and 35. We have zoom lenses 17 to 28, 28-75, and the brand new 70 to 180 as well. So we do have a number of lenses out there, and hopefully more to come real soon, because we're really jumping into it. But yes, there are a number of lenses, and check out Looking Glass for what you can do. So,
and
more to add to that?
I will say, well, my answer is, oh yes, we definitely do, or something like that.
Oh, yeah.
The 28-75 was #1 selling lens in the world. Was it last year or the year before? So not only does Tamron make lenses for the E-mount, but they have made what have really kind of been considered some of the best lenses, not only for size, weight, optical quality, but it's not going to hurt your pocketbook either, which is great. you said that you'd hope that we would, we had Tamron had more Sony lenses coming, and I feel like honestly, Ken, you sit in a few of those meetings. I feel like Ken has a pretty good idea of what is